You alright, folks? Welcome back. So, it may have escaped your attention, but the idea that retail as a generally poor new player experience has cropped up here and there for a while now. And one summer's eve, whilst talking to myself in the shower, as you do, I kind of found it hard to disagree with that idea. And as a classic player, I naturally start to draw comparisons, particularly after my recent Is It Too Late series, and so I thought I'd share my deranged ramblings with you lot. Now, mainly I'll be focusing on the starting experience more than anything because that is the game's first impression, and that's what should hook new players. It should teach you the basics of what the game has to offer and only expand upon those as you progress. It should also be an enjoyable part of the game that ropes you in. What I'm going to do in this video is just go over the starting experiences of both Classic and Retail and point out some key differences that, in my opinion at least, show Retail isn't really being designed for new blood and comes with the expectation of years worth of knowledge. But firstly, I think it's not unfair to say that WoW as an entity is struggling to reel in players the way it used to. Dragonfly has done a decent job at slowing the exodus of Retail players and is doing alright at retaining the folk who stuck it out through the 1-2 dick punch of BFA and Shadowlands. But that is mainly the more experienced player. People who were active in those expansions, and as such they're not new players. If you're a new player going into Retail, it can be one hell of an overwhelming and at the same time massively counterproductive experience. So let's get into Retail then. What do? You log into the game and you're presented with the character creation screen, which is admittedly pretty cool. There's no doubt about it. Graphically, Retail knows what it's doing. The fancy animations for each class, respective gear you are shown, and general flashiness is interesting and eye-catching. The only thing that's a bit iffy is when you're greeted with the options that are greyed out. Now, this can be a bit contentious. I'm of the opinion the way they did it in the old days is just the least painful. You've bought the expansion that comes with the new shiny races, so let me play them from the get-go instead of having to unlock them in the game. They've been chipping away at the allied race restrictions for a while now, so just let the people who haven't gotten round to it yet have the bloody things. If you've not got the respective expansion, fair enough, I get that. But say you were really taken with the Zandalari Trolls, and that's the race you want to play. But, you're new and you haven't done the prerequisite achievement, but that's the race you want to play. So you're going to have to make a character to unlock it. At that point, you're playing the game not out of a desire to play the game, but out of a want to unlock something so you can actually start playing the game in a way you want. But beyond that, you log in and you're presented with a quest giver who is comically close to the character. He's got the quest giver exclamation mark, a gold outline, and basically screams, "Don't look at anything else! Ignore everything! Speak to me! This is the correct way to play!" Which, for an open world MMO, is a bit ridiculous. Nevertheless, the exceptionally hard-to-miss quest giver provides your first quest. Pretty simple. Go kill or collect X, and immediately you get this pop-up on your mini-map. A small blue outline showing you where to go. It's a bit crap. I mean, it doesn't teach you anything as a new player. Yeah, it shows you where to go, but it teaches you nothing other than, don't worry about the world, we'll be telling you where something is at every turn, so don't bother learning anything, exploring, making mistakes, or anything like that. Just look for the blue. And, yeah, okay, from an experienced player standpoint, it's nice not having to think sometimes, but I played when that wasn't a thing, so I had to read quests and just figure out what to do. But once you get to a hub and all these quests overlap, your map and mini-map just become this confusing mess of randomly shaped blue patches, which is even worse, especially for a new player. So, you complete your first quest, you've seen that XP bar go up, and the dots are connecting. Fill bar increase level not so complex. You're also given your first bit of loot, and this is where things go from, oh, this could be an interesting experience, to what the actual fuck is the point of this? Blizzard fairly recently updated the starter gear for new characters. Up until this point, it had pretty much been the same since vanilla, with only the odd cosmetic tweak. So, yeah, an update was due. But before the upgrade, you got a shirt, a chest piece with either no or next to no stats, some legs, boots, and a weapon for your respective class. That's it, pretty basic as it should be. With the update, they now outfit you with a set of gear, minus your misc slots, a helmet, and shoulders. There isn't anything special about this gear, it's only white items with 1 or 2 armor on, it's just there so you don't spawn in stark bollock naked. But the problem stems from the fact that, at least in the case of the Night Elves, which, as you're seeing, is the race I ended up going for with this, I didn't get a single bloody upgrade until I was nearly out of Shadowglen, which makes me wonder, and would rightly make anyone wonder, what is the point in those items, and being rewarded with a texture swap of the same item I already have. So, yay. Great, I guess. And I will get into it more later, but this is something in contrast that Classic handles, like, really well. It's not even complex, it's as basic as anything, and it feels like Blizzard, in an attempt to make things fresh and interesting, only went on to make it more boring and pointless because the gear is now meaningless. Another thing is that, at least in the very early levels, you get a new ability per level, which is a bit peculiar to me, particularly because levels come thick and fast. Shadowglen took me a grand total of 15 minutes start to finish, and I barely looked at the place. And in that time, I was given Moonfire, Regrowth, Entangling Roots, Catform, and then by extension, Shred, all in 15 minutes. In Classic, that's like a 20-level gap between the first and last of those skills. Now, I'm an experienced player, I know what spells like those do. I know I don't need half of them at this level in retail, but even in having them, the damaging ones anyway, just decimate. Like, there is no threat from the open world at this, and frankly any level really, and apart from Moonfire, I never had the chance to use them. In days gone by, you'd only get a new ability every couple of levels, but by the time it took you to get those levels, you'd been out in the world for a fair while. Now, this isn't the case for every spell, because some were admittedly duds, but for the most part, the important spells, you had time to use them. Learn what they're for, and as you go, find better ways to utilise that toolkit. And once you'd reached a place where you could learn more spells, you were decently familiar with what came before. You weren't overwhelmed with this constant barrage of new abilities that you probably won't find a use for, in some cases, until max level endgame content. That aside, I carried on and ended up at the Spider Caves. Now, in retail, as in previous expansions, these are the first hostile mobs you will come across in this area. This should be a relatively big moment because it teaches you not every mob will be neutral, because every other mob in Shadowglen is in fact neutral. Yeah, you're kicking the spit out of them, but until you do, they will happily just leave you alone. So, these are the first mobs that will attack you on sight. In retail, the spiders are just another XP pinata. They don't do anything special, at least that I noticed, because they were very dead very quickly. They aren't menacing in numbers and are easily squished, which wasn't the case when the game came out, or even in Classic today. Yes, a skilled player won't have any issue with them, but if I was to pull too many of them on a brand new Night Elf in Classic, I would still get eaten. Cool thing though, and this has been a part of this particular starting experience since Cataclysm, is that in retail when you go to the Spider Caves, the quest giver shows up with you. It makes you feel like the NPCs are also active participants in the world, and it is admittedly nice to switch up from the age-old static quest giver from time to time. It also allows you to progress this little story then and there, instead of running back and forth. However, I once again had the thought, what is the point? Because after doing the Githis the Vile quest, which is the big spider at the back of the cave, I got a follow-up quest from the Dryad following me around, which was a simple affair. Go speak to Dentaria Silverglade, a quest giver we'd spoken to prior. However, it was at this point in the game definitely felt as if it didn't trust me to follow the most basic of instructions, because I was immediately teleported in front of the quest giver, by the ponds, next to the big tree, which is a distance away from the Spider Caves, meaning that whoever designed this did not trust the player in question to be able to fight their way out of the cave. They just fought their way through to go find a quest giver they had previously spoken to, which is a really weird feeling. It's as if Blizz don't expect players to be paying attention to their world, whilst simultaneously giving them no reason to pay attention to their world because they get teleported about the place. Now, you may be wondering, hold on, didn't you just say it was nice not having to run back and forth? Yes, I did, but there is a difference between literally being teleported in front of the quest NPC you were just tasked to go and speak to, completely bypassing any chance for exploration, killing mobs, potential drops, chests, etc., and clearing our cave running back to a quest giver, that same quest giver then telling you to go back into that cave for a single named mob you could have reasonably just killed whilst you were in there the first time. One is efficient storytelling, the other is lazy design that thinks very little of the player engaging in that content. I just don't get how any of this is meant to be a good experience for a new player. They have no challenge to face at low levels, thereby they learn nothing about their class that matters or really how to engage with the world outside of murder everything. This is compounded by the fact abilities are just thrown at them every level, and because of the speed at which you level, you have no time to get acclimated with your toolkit, and in a lot of cases, the ability you got from the previous level you won't have used once by the time you get to the next. Again, less of an issue if you've played everything for as long as I have. I don't necessarily need to hang around and read every quest. Sometimes I like to, but I don't need to. So going quickly is pretty standard for me. And even when I haven't played retail in a while, I still know what the abilities do for the most part. I'm not saying I can play every class and spec at a high level after a many months long hiatus, but I've been using Moonfire, Regrowth, Entangling Roots and so on for nigh on 20 years. I know where that shit goes and how to use it. Shadowlands kinda gave the new player experience a bit of a facelift with the level squish that took place, and you've now got an admittedly pretty interesting but ultimately linear introduction experience with Exile's Reach. I do enjoy Exile's Reach, honestly I do, but again, experienced player here. Back to Shadowglen, there was never more than a single quest at once, and as such no choice in what quest to approach until I got to Dolinar. Not a big deal you might think, but given it only took me 15 minutes to complete Shadowglen, if I was able to do multiple quests at once, it might have allowed me to explore that area a bit more, and just spend some more time getting used to the toolkit I was being given. And in Pre-Kata, from like the third quest onwards, that's kind of what happens. You get a handful, and you can go about them in any which way you choose. Yes, they do end up, like, gathering in the same area, but again, you have to read the quests, and it all makes sense why you end up at that one clave, because it's leading you to your first hostile mobs. And yeah, it just gives players the freedom to explore and make their own decisions based on the information they are given. Exile's Reach isn't much better in this regard either. You've got the quest with a bear that's off to the side and something you might miss, but it's visible on the map and essentially going, "Hello, I'm over here." So there's not much in the way of exploration there. You might get one or two quests at the same time, but it's generally for the same little area on the island. Again, it seems to favour doing it bit by bit instead of giving the player the choice to run around and do it in whatever order they fancy. I'm not going to knock Exile's Reach too much. It's meant to be its own little contained story, and that's fine, but I think it could still give the player a bit more freedom in how it tells that story. And you could argue that the original starting zones are just behind the times and in need of an update. On that, I would heavily agree. I thought that since BFA, Night Elves and Undead at the very least need a new zone following the events of that expansion. It is a little bit jarring going back to Teldrassil after Sylvanas turned it into firewood, and Tirisfal after the Alliance smashed it to pieces and Sylvanas committed yet another war crime with her patented chemical warfare. But Summit being out of date is not a free pass for being a poor experience. It should only go on to highlight that the experience itself is in need of a much bigger facelift. Then there's Chromie Time, which, again, conflicting. It allows you to choose what you want to do and where you want to do it, and unlike in the previous expansions, you no longer had to go through the expansions in their release order. If you wanted, you'd go to Draenor straight away and experience WoD from level 10 onwards. And yeah, in theory, this is a good idea for people already playing the game or fairly experienced returning players. Me, for example, I did all of those zones when they were current content and for years after the fact. There is nothing new there for me to experience, and as such, I know the zones I like and dislike and what to avoid or target, but even with that, sometimes I just feel like doing a zone or expansion I'd normally pass on by. It's kind of like going out to eat. Your go-to and general favourite is a Texas barbecue pizza with stuffed crust and all the trimmings. But you've gotten that the last few times you've gone out, and this time you just fancy something different. Maybe you order a burger or a fat-ass steak. Doesn't mean you dislike the pizza anymore, you just fancied the change. Spice of life and all that. And again, for someone who's played the game for nigh on 20 years, that's great. I don't need to, nor do I want to approach leveling and what would be considered content new players should spend a good portion of their time partaking in the same way each and every time. And at this stage, I've already done my leveling anyway. I've got all my toons set in stone, and I've only leveled in recent years for allied races and the related rewards. To continue the food metaphor, retail leveling from 10 onwards for a new player is much like giving someone who has never eaten an entire menu and expecting them to pick something they'll enjoy. Yes, they might point something out at random and like it, but the odds are definitely against them. They weren't eased in with turkey dinosaurs as a kid, so they won't appreciate a gourmet meal. Back to WoW, a new player who ends up in front of Chromie being told, hey, you can go to any of these places. Cool. What does that mean? How are they supposed to understand any of that information? Regardless of whether you do Exiles, Reach, or the OG starting zones, you will eventually end up in your major city with a dragon that likes cosplaying a gnome telling you that you can go to any of these places with no real context as to what they are. Just an interface that turns Stormwind or Orgrimmar into a lobby, even more than it had been in previous years, instead of a bustling faction capital where you go and trade, socialise, form groups, etc, etc. Because you go there, choose your expansion, and then zip away again, instead of being out in the open world and organically moving from zone to zone until you've reached a point that you need to move on to pastures more challenging. And I know that the selection menu gives like a little rundown of what each zone is, but that's meaningless. I mean, if you weren't there at the time or moved through it at the relevant level, just getting a little blurb saying, this is Northrend, this is the Lich King, he's bad, go and fight him. Again, meaningless information. And honestly, at this point, I don't know why retail even has leveling, because it is just an arbitrary system that you use to increase that number on your portrait until you get to the point you can start doing endgame. The experience is hollow, and it's been designed by Blizzard to reward linearity and sticking to rails as much as possible in order to expedite your path to max level. So, let's have a look at Classic. What do you do when you start there then? Well, you choose your faction, race, and class. Not necessarily in that order, but ultimately those are the big three choices when a new player boots up for the first time, same as retail. You make your first character, decide on a name, and then hit that Enter World button. You're immediately presented with a neat little cinematic, generally starting at your race's capital, or maybe a nearby town, and as the camera pans to you in the starting zone, you get a brief overview of the race you've chosen and their place in the world. This is neat for a couple of reasons. You get a bit of story, whether you give a damn or not, but its flavour, world building, both important things in any RPG, and the cinematic isn't a pre-rendered thing or phased or anything like that. It's your actual camera in the live version of the game world. You might see other players sat at the city entrance dueling one another, maybe other low-level characters running along the path to the next village. It plants the seed that there is a world outside of where you begin. It can instill in you one of your earliest goals, to find the big city. Now, before you slap me, I know this still happens in retail, and I'm not being deliberately choosy with not putting it here, but what can I say? It just hits different in Classic because all of this actually fits and contributes to the world you're about to step foot into. It's a small cog, but it does fit nicely and it helps keep the mechanism turning. In retail, it's just a bit of prattle that doesn't really add to the overall feel. I think that's mainly down to the fact that a lot of them are just plain old out of date. For anything that was around at the time of Cataclysm, the voiceover just waffles on about Deathwing and related incidents. But half an hour later, you're able to wander off to an alien planet in an alternate universe. Those things do not align neatly. And for the Night Elves in particular, it goes on about Malfurion returning from the Emerald Dream, despite the fact he's now currently chilling in the Shadowlands, and that him and Tyrande are trying to make a life for their people whilst cleansing Teldrassil. That went well, didn't it? In Classic though, once that cutscene, or whatever you want to call it, is done, you're plonked firmly in your starting zone, and generally ahead of you is some bloke with a big yellow exclamation mark floating above his head. Now, this is not as in your face as retail, and if you've got tutorials on, it might gently nudge you in that direction. Advise that speaking to him is the best course of action, but you are no means forced into that, or I should say, feel forced into that. The game is heavily hinting there is something different about that weird dwarf staring into the middle distance and drooling on himself. But if you were so inclined, you could turn on your heel and fuck off up the path to find a cool city built into the mountain. But say you do go and speak to that NPC with the exclamation mark. As with retail, you'll be given your first quest, and then you're told to go due east from your current location and collect 10 wolf spleens or something equally ridiculous, and in return you'll be given money, experience, and maybe an item for doing so. There's no blue blob on your map, mini or otherwise, just instructions in the quest, and by mining said instructions you can work out what to do, where to go, and just begin your adventure that way. In this one interaction, upon immediately logging into the game, you've been given a load of information that will never not be useful in any sense, in classic, in an easy to digest format. The exclamation mark means quest. Quest gives direction that can lead to exploration. Exploration and completing quest means reward. Rewards mean progression. Even doing the quest itself, you'll start seeing that experience bar go up. What happens when it's full? You can probably take an educated guess it means you'll level up, but you won't know for sure until you do it. And the rewards themselves aren't stellar by any means. At the earliest levels, it's all white gear with armor, but it's better than what you have. You want to go and do the quest to gather 7 gremlin testicles, because the quest giver will then fashion a fetching pair of bracers from them. It's only 3 armor, but you haven't got any bracers. It's new, it's something, it's progress. Slow and steady, but it's progress. You get XP as well, which is worth its weight in gold, particularly in Classic. So, actually taking a look at a starting zone again, Night Elves to mirror retail, you spawn in and lo and behold, the Ishnu guy is there, but this time he is not trying to aggressively snog you, nor is he lit up like a Christmas tree. He stood a ways off, exclamation mark over his head. As I said, the game is making it clear that there's something different about that NPC, and that maybe you should go and speak to him, but it doesn't feel forced here. If you wanted to up sticks and make your way to Dunmoreau and go befriend the dwarves, gnomes, and, explore along the way, crack on. The only resistance there is going to be a level 20 crocolisk that eats you when you get to the wetlands, which is a very important lesson in and of itself. Be wary, there are things out there in the world bigger and stronger than you, and they will not hesitate to tear you several new ones. But yes, you go speak to the chap with the exclamation mark above his head and you get your first quest. Go cull the local wildlife. As I go about my business killing things, I get purple text briefly appear next to my character that says 50 XP. It's the same colour as the bar above my abilities and is increasing every kill. The dots are connecting, and as I kill mobs, I loot a bunch of crap for the most part, but on occasion I get a grey piece of gear. Immediately upon starting my questing journey, I've seen that mobs drop possible gear upgrades, and so I put them on. Again, they aren't great, but an upgrade even small is meaningful when you have nothing. Whilst out and about for this quest, I spot a couple more NPCs with quest markers, so I go and speak to them. It's Dentaria Silverglade from earlier. She tells us to go look for her mate Iveron. The only information we are given is he's around the cave to the north. Okay, instructions are minimal but concise and clear, so I check my map and lo and behold, on that map is a cave to the north clearly marked. So once I pick up the next quest, which is to speak to Tarindrella, which leads to a quest to kill some Grail, and once I've done all of that, I go make my way north and am greeted with another quest. Go collect 10 venom sacs from the spiders that live in the cave to the north. Oh look, things are coming together now. Once I get up there, I see the cave entrance, and outside, some spiders. At this point, I've also gotten the next Balance of Nature quest from the Ishnu guy. On my way to that cave, I start seeing the mobs that I need for that. So, just following basic instruction, I'm in an area that basically has all of my quests in. I don't need a big blue marker on my map, just read the quests and boom. And when I do those quests, it leads me all around the zone, because at the very least, in regards to the Balance of Nature quest, those mobs have quite a wide spawn area, so I actually explore areas of that zone in Classic that just get completely bypassed in Retail. So I find Iveron, and I just, get to completing the quests in my log. By this point, I've also visited the Druid Trainer once. It shows me the abilities available to me at this stage, what level I need to get them, and how much they're going to cost me to learn. Again, it's teaching you something rather than telling you something. That being, trainers teach new abilities. Abilities are available every couple of levels, but I need to buy them. The price increases each time I can learn them, so I will need to factor in my funds and what abilities I want to spend my limited resources on. And that's a relevant thing to know for the entirety of the leveling experience, which should be a fundamental and sizable portion of the new player experience. The game introduces you to this system through a simple quest, rather than an intrusive pop-up or random window, or, just throwing the spell at you for no good bloody reason. You speak to usually an NPC you've already been dealing with. They give you a letter or a glyph, a rune, something to that effect, and say, go have a chat with your trainer. It feels organic and in keeping with an RPG and not just a HUD thing telling you should do it. So you pottle off, speak to them, and Bob's your uncle. You are also taught another valuable lesson that is just completely absent in retail, which is inventory management. Around the caves, I ran into that age-old trouble of lack of bag space. Had no luck with a bag drop and forgot to go sell stuff. As I'm doing the kill quests, I have to make a decision as I am getting upgrades drop. So it's about making that space, possibly losing out on a little bit of money when I go back into town. But I got me an item which is generally worth that sort of trade-off. In retail, you don't have to store quest items and you rarely get trash items either. So the bag space you have, even limited, is still freed up for the most part. And by the time I got to Dolinar, I'd been given 2 6-slot bags through the quests. Now in Classic, if a starting zone had a quest that gave you a bag, it wouldn't be bigger than a 4-slot, and you had to rely on a lucky drop, or again, deciding if using your limited funds on buying a more substantial bag from the general goods vendor was worth it. By the time I finished all those quests and head back to town, I'm level 4. So I go hand in all the quests, get some upgrades, money, sell the crap in my bags, and then go visit my trainer again. This time I can pick up 2 spells, Moonfire and Rejuvenation. I have the money to afford those abilities, but after I get them, I'm effectively broke. However, as abilities, they are pretty clever, because the spells you start with as a druid in Classic, Wrath and Healing Touch, are ones whose effect is immediate. You have a cast time, but once that cast gets off, the damage or healing is done. But those 2 new spells are over time abilities, and are actually pretty important to a druid's toolkit, and will be relevant throughout all your playtime. It also allows you to switch up what you're doing depending on the situation. I know it's not a massive leap and you've not had hours to use Wrath, and only Wrath, but you've had a couple of levels, some quests are done, and you've just been exploring. And even though the early levels are pretty quick in Classic, you learn very early on that the next level will take longer than the one that came before, so you will have time to use these abilities before you get something new. And when I use those abilities, I run out of mana. Generally after a couple of uses, which leads me to using my melee weapon. Both of those things are simply unheard of in retail for a caster class. And again, it teaches you early on, mana is an important resource and you can't expect to blow everything up with no issue. You will need to drink, and certainly later on, plan out how to approach groups of mobs, lest you find yourself without mana and overwhelmed by mobs. From there, I go start sweeping up all the bits and pieces for Ivoron's antidote, and I also had another quest which required me to go into the spider caves properly and not just pick off stragglers on the front porch. This is the first dangerous area I've been in, as all the mobs are aggressive, and if I'm not careful, I will die. It's as simple as that. I know what I'm doing, but in numbers, I will be screwed at this level. The spiders also poison me. It's not massive, but it's my first encounter with something that wasn't an auto attack. And in theory, to counter the poison, I could just pop Rejuve, and that's that. It's simple but effective. It encourages you to take a look at what damage is being done to you and assess your toolkit to see if there's something you can do about it. Go to the end of the cave and face off against Githis the Vile. You may remember him from earlier. In this instance, he's not the mob we need. In fact, he isn't a quest objective at all. His name was only mentioned while speaking to Ivoron beforehand, so it's a nice little narrative touch. But we kill him, collect the egg we need, and off we go. In retail, this was the stage where I was unceremoniously teleported in front of Dentaria, completely skipping the cave and near enough everything else between me and her. Classic though, I gotta run out. And as I do, I spot a chest, my first. And again, it's a little thing, but an important piece of information I will call back on every time I'm in a similar environment. Next time I'm in a cave, later on in my travels, could be that I remember I found a chest in one of the early zones. Didn't have much in, but that was, say, 20 levels ago. Maybe this one has something, maybe a blue item. So whilst in said cave, I explore it, see what I can find. I may not find that chest, but because I have that in my head that one time I did, every cave I go into now, I'm looking for another one. It's just something that encourages exploration. It's honestly quite challenging to emphasize how impactful a moment like that is. It's so simple, yet so brilliant. I would never have seen this chest going the route I did to get to the quest objective, because the layout of this particular cave I had to take a different route out, so I noticed it. It encourages exploration, adventure, being out in the world. You don't need to be slaying dragons every 5 minutes, you could be spelunking and finding hidden treasure. It just makes you feel like you're in an RPG and not an action-adventure game where timed events and continually going faster and faster and faster is the goal. Anyway, out of the cave we go, finish up Ivoron's antidote, and the follow-up quest is a timed one. Ironic given my previous statement, but the odd timed quest here or there isn't a bad thing, and you will honestly go several zones between them, and unlike in retail, if you screw it up, you just go again. You aren't going to have 4 other people potentially losing their tin bits. Once that's done, finish up by speaking to Teneron at the top of the tree, do the Moonwell quest, which is pretty cleverly done actually. As you walk out of the room with the quest giver, you can see the Moonwell ahead of you. The quest says it's to the north, which is where it is, and you can kind of put 2 and 2 together. It's basically a pond with elven things around it. No picture or blob on the map required. It says go fill up a vial of water. There is a small body of water ahead of you. Just go to it and see what happens. Once do that quest, I am done with Shadow Glen and I can make my way out. And it was a far better introduction to Azeroth and the things in it than retail was. Instead of a quick 15 minutes in and out jobs done affair, this took me around 45, and I got a lot more out of the experience, which I've just gone over. And I've not touched on raiding or dungeoneering or PvP. Those things are very subjective, and neither version of the game does them badly. They're just approached differently and attract a somewhat different crowd. You could say the same thing for this, but WoW is meant to be an MMORPG. Retail does not feel like one for quite a while, and to paraphrase a far more impressive individual, if your game takes 100 hours to get good, your game's not good. Why would a new player stick out the generally poor leveling experience just to get to the raids and Mythic Plus because the people doing that content says it's great, but they've got to slog through stuff that is ill-paced and ill-designed? The game should be good throughout, and from there it can go on to be exceptional with endgame. It ultimately boils down to the fact that if you aren't max level in retail and doing endgame content, be that raids, Mythic Plus, transmog farming, mount farming, and so on, then it doesn't feel like you're actually playing the game. It feels like you're jumping through arbitrary hoops in order to start playing the game. In Classic, it's a different story. It feels like you're playing a game and meaningfully progressing from the get-go. Even if you're only, say, level 37, sat in Ironforge doing professions, playing the auction house or whatever, you're still an active participant in the world, and you don't need to rush to max level and start felling bosses. Sure, seeing a dude in full tier 2 on an epic mount might entice you. You know, it's dangling of the fruit. But ultimately, you still have a journey and a hell of a lot more game to play before you get there. And that's what's important. A new player shouldn't have to essentially speedrun or feel like they have to speedrun the leveling portion of the game in order to play the game. And they should be able to learn something new and have a meaningful experience at level 37. Whereas in retail, there is nothing meaningful about being level 37. You just feel like you're behind. Sure, you could do professions and play the auction house, but you don't need to do the versions of the professions that are relevant for the level you're at. You can just wait for the current stuff when you hit that expansion, and money is never going to be an issue in retail, so unless you want to be filthy rich, you don't need to really bother. Even things like mounts aren't a fun experience. You get your first at 10, fast ground at 20, flying at 30. Again, where's the fun? Where's the goal? Play for a couple of hours and boom, you're already in the air. Whereas that was once a max level feat. It was amazing having a flying mount in BC and yeah, in Wrath, because you were max level. You were gonna have a dragon at this point. It makes sense. You know, you shouldn't see a level 20 or level 30 on a proto Drake. It feels wrong. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier. I don't know why retail even has leveling at this point, because it's completely meaningless and has no soul to it anymore. And even smaller than that, during the classic starting zone, I could pick up items that I couldn't use, and quests had the options for me to select items I couldn't use. Retail got rid of that ages ago, and I still don't get why. Being able to see items even if you can't use them makes you go, ooh, that's cool. Maybe I'll make a character that can use that item at some point. The dangling of the forbidden fruit just really doesn't exist in retail. It's far too clean and manufactured. You're a leather wearer, so you can only see leather armor. That's a bit dull. I'm not saying Classic is perfect on that front either. Sometimes you get quests whose rewards in their entirety are of no use to you because, say you're a priest and the reward is a two-handed sword or a male pair of pants. Fair enough, that's not a great feeling, but the fix there is just to have a selection of items with at least one for each armor type or something to that effect. Not completely remove all of the items that you can't use from view. And I know I could have gone through the entire zone of Teldrassil. I did consider it, but then I reflected upon my own personal experiences a bit more, and I realised I don't really remember the first time I killed the Hogger, or the first time I completed Mulgore. I remember snippets of those zones, particularly Mulgore because I played my druid a hell of a lot back then, but never the full thing. But one thing that does stick out in my mind every time, more than anything, is the first time I logged into a zone. The first time I saw Northshire Abbey, Camp Narache, the crypt in Deathnell, and the first few quests in those areas, because it was engrossing. Those areas are WoW's introductory handshake with new players, and Retail's is decidedly weak. I could have also gone over every facet of both versions of WoW, pick the bones clean, all of that. But that has been done for both versions of the game in excruciating and hilarious detail by better people. I wanted this to be about the impression you'd get as a new player picking up WoW for the first time, and Classic fundamentally is a better experience if you're new to the franchise or MMOs in general. So, if you're looking to get into WoW, what I would say is this. If you're looking for an MMO, an experience you can work away at bit by bit and generally enjoy at every stage of the game, pick up Classic. You will lose all semblance of a social life, showering will become an afterthought, and food will be that thing your phone is for. But if you're more a weekend explorer, you want to do raids, dungeons, etc., but due to life being life, your time is exceptionally limited, and you prefer those quick and repetitive dopamine hits, and you aren't really fussed about an early or mid-game experience, give Retail a go. It's got a better lineup for that sort of gameplay style. The TLDR of this whole thing is that I took the same starting area in both versions of WoW, and in Retail it took me 15 minutes to go through before I was spat out into the wider Teldrassil zone. In those 15 minutes I was put on rails near enough immediately, with barely a chance to breathe as constant information was just being thrown at me with no hope of digesting said information before the next round of things was lobbed at my head. Exploration was very much discouraged by things like the teleporting. A level 5 does not need to be teleported anywhere. They are a level 5, and there was no challenge, no chance of death unless I was actively looking to kill my character, which taught me nothing about the class I was playing. Classic took me 3 times as long to do roughly the same quests. The information was presented in a more digestible format, and I had the time to soak it up. Every bit of information made sense and is something the game will go on to expand as the adventure continues, and it felt like I was in a world that would chew me up and spit me out if I wasn't careful. And with things like mana running out and having to use melee weapons, it taught me that my class is reliant on its resource and I need to be careful in using it. It's only 5 levels, I know, but it is up to the game to prepare you for what happens outside the safety of your starting area during that time. And Classic gives you all the tools you will need to progress forward from there. Retail just says, don't worry about this place, you won't be here long. And this isn't here just to piss on Retail and sing Classic's praises. Retail does things right sometimes, Classic does things wrong sometimes. Unfortunately, the early game experience for a new player ain't one of those things that Retail gets right. But this has gone on long enough, so that'll be me. If you'd be so kind as to like, sub, share your pals and so on, that'd be grand, and I would greatly appreciate it. Have a good one, folks. Bye for now.